Hello everyone, welcome back to Gloom Woods Carnage. Tonight, we venture deep into the ancient mountains and forgotten hollows of Appalachia with 8 chilling tales of encounters with forces that defy explanation, adapted from true events reported by those who survived to tell their stories. Each narrative has been carefully crafted, drawing from the terrifying experiences of park rangers, loggers, researchers, and locals who claim to have witnessed things in these deep woods that should not exist. From missing hikers who leave impossible tracks to ancient entities disturbed by modern machinery, these accounts span generations of those who have learned why certain places in the mountains carry warnings passed down through bloodlines. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and details have been altered, but the core experiences remain as they were reported. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Gloom Woods Carnage for daily true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the wilderness reveals its most guarded secrets. About 3 years ago, a park ranger filed an incident report that still keeps him awake at night. The official version sits in a filing cabinet somewhere in a Parks Canada office, sanitized and bureaucratic, stripped of every detail that might make someone question his mental state or professional competency. But the real story, the one that follows, has never been shared outside his family until now. His name was Alastair Finch, and for over 15 years he had been a park ranger in the maritime provinces. He dealt with everything from lost tourists to bear encounters, from illegal hunting operations to search and rescue missions in terrain that would break most people. He thought he had seen it all until he was assigned to a remote section of the Appalachian Trail system that cuts through the dense wilderness of northern New Brunswick. The incident began on a Tuesday morning in late September when he received a call from dispatch about 2 overdue hikers. Clara Evans and Leo Chen, both experienced backpackers, had planned a 5-day trek through the Caledonia Highlands. They were supposed to check in at the ranger station on Monday evening, but never showed. Their emergency contact, Clara's sister, hadn't heard from them since they sent a text message on Saturday saying they were making good time and would be off-grid for the next few days. Standard protocol for overdue hikers involves a graduated response. First, the parking areas and trailheads are checked for their vehicle. Then, local accommodations and nearby ranger stations are contacted. If that yields nothing, a formal search is initiated. Clara and Leo's silver SUV was still parked at the Pine Creek trailhead, exactly where they had left it 4 days earlier. Their gear appeared untouched, and there were no signs of forced entry or disturbance around the vehicle. Alastair started his search at first light on Wednesday, following the main trail they had indicated on their filed hiking plan. The Pine Creek Trail is a moderately challenging route that winds through old-growth forest for about 12 kilometers before connecting to a network of smaller paths that lead deeper into the wilderness. The terrain is rugged but well-marked. Inexperienced hikers like Clara and Leo should have had no trouble navigating it, even in poor weather conditions. The first unusual thing he noticed was about 6 kilometers in, near a creek crossing that the trail guides call Deadman's Ford. The wooden bridge that normally spanned the water had been damaged, apparently by a recent storm, forcing hikers to find an alternate crossing point. He could see where someone had been exploring options along the bank, and he found clear boot prints in the mud that matched the size and tread pattern of hiking boots. 2 distinct sets, one smaller than the other, consistent with what he would expect from Clara and Leo. But there was something else in the mud that made him stop and examine the scene more carefully. Mixed in with the human footprints were tracks he had never seen before in 15 years of wilderness work. They were roughly humanoid in shape but elongated, nearly twice the length of a normal human foot. The impression in the mud showed what appeared to be 4 toes, each ending in a sharp point that had gouged deep into the soft earth. The spacing and gait suggested something bipedal, but the stride length was impossibly long, nearly 2 meters between steps. He documented the tracks with his camera and GPS unit, though he knew the photographs would never capture the unsettling quality of seeing them in person. There was something about the depth and clarity of the impressions that suggested whatever had made them was significantly heavier than a human. Yet the tracks showed no sign of the clumsy, shuffling gait one might expect from a large animal moving upright. These prints were deliberate, purposeful, and they seemed to follow the same path the hikers had taken across the creek. Following the trail on the opposite bank, Alistair found more evidence of Clara and Leo's passage. A protein bar wrapper wedged between 2 rocks, clearly dropped recently. A small section of fabric caught on a low branch, dark blue material that matched the description of Leo's hiking jacket. But the strange tracks continued as well, sometimes paralleling the hiking trail, sometimes crossing it, always maintaining that impossible stride length. About 2 kilometers past the creek crossing, the official trail splits into 3 smaller paths. The main route continues northwest toward the Caledonia Peaks, while 2 smaller trails branch off to the east and southwest. According to their filed plan, Clara and Leo should have taken the northwest route, but the tracks he was following, both human and otherwise, led toward the eastern branch. The Eastern Trail is not recommended for casual hikers. It leads into some of the most remote wilderness in the province, through terrain that has remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. The forest here is dense and ancient, with massive pine and oak trees that block out most of the sunlight even during midday. The understory is thick with ferns and fallen logs, creating a maze of shadows and hidden obstacles that can disorient even experienced woodsmen. Alistair followed the tracks for another hour, growing increasingly concerned about what he might find. The human footprints were becoming less distinct, as if Clara and Leo were moving more quickly or less carefully than before. In contrast, the strange tracks seemed to grow clearer and more numerous. At several points, it appeared as though multiple sets of the elongated prints converged on the trail from different directions. He reached a small clearing about 8 kilometers from the main trail where he found their campsite. Clara and Leo had set up their tent in a level area near a small stream, following good backcountry practices for water access and drainage. But something had gone terribly wrong here. The tent was still standing, but the rainfly had been torn away and lay crumpled against a nearby tree. The zippers on the tent were closed, but when he examined the interior, he found clear signs of a struggle. Sleeping bags were twisted and pulled partially out of the tent. Leo's backpack was overturned, its contents scattered across the tent floor. Clara's hiking boots were inside the tent, but her jacket and pack were nowhere to be found. Most disturbing was the damage to the tent floor, which showed long, parallel tears as if something with sharp claws had raked across the fabric from underneath. He called for backup immediately and established a perimeter around the campsite to preserve any evidence. While waiting for the search team to arrive, he conducted a careful examination of the area around the tent. The strange tracks were everywhere, circling the campsite in patterns that suggested systematic stalking behavior. Whatever had made them had approached from multiple directions, spending considerable time observing the camp before moving in. He found drag marks leading away from the tent toward the deeper forest. The pattern suggested that something had been pulled rather than carried, leaving deep furrows in the soft earth and scattered pine needles. He followed the trail for about 50 meters before losing it in a rocky area where the ground was too hard to show clear impressions. The official search lasted 6 days and involved over 30 personnel, including K-9 units, helicopter support, and expert trackers. They found additional evidence of Clara and Leo's presence scattered throughout the area. Clara's jacket, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, was discovered hanging from a branch nearly 4 kilometers from their campsite. Leo's water bottle was found even further away, dented and partially buried under a pile of leaves that looked deliberately arranged, but they never found them. The search was officially suspended after 8 days when weather conditions deteriorated and the risk to additional personnel became too great. The case remains open, classified as a presumed wilderness accident with no specific cause of death determined. What Alastair never included in his official report were the other things they found during that search. The discovery of similar elongated tracks at multiple locations throughout the search area, always leading deeper into the wilderness and away from any established trails. The strange arrangements of rocks and branches they encountered in several locations, constructed in patterns too deliberate to be natural, but serving no apparent purpose. The reports from other search team members of feeling watched while working in certain areas, and the consistent problems they had with electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific geographic locations. Most significantly, he never reported what he found on the final day of the search when he was working alone in a remote sector nearly 10 kilometers from the original campsite. Following a faint game trail through particularly dense forest, he came across what he could only describe as a collection site. In a natural depression surrounded by massive oak trees, someone, or something, had gathered objects that clearly did not belong in the wilderness. There were pieces of camping equipment from multiple sources, some so weathered and faded that they had obviously been there for years. Backpack straps, tent stakes, water bottles, and hiking boots were arranged in neat piles, as if sorted by type. Among these items, he recognized Leo's distinctive red hiking hat and Clara's metal camp cup, both placed carefully on a flat rock in the center of the depression. But what made him immediately radio for extraction and never return to that area was the realization that many of the other items predated Clara and Leo's disappearance by years, possibly decades. He found tent fabric in colors and patterns that had not been manufactured in over 20 years, hiking boots in styles that went out of production in the 1990s, water bottles bearing logos of companies that had gone out of business before he even became a ranger. He has never spoken about what he found in that depression, and he instructed the helicopter pilot to mark their extraction point as inaccessible due to terrain concerns. The official report lists the area as unsearched, and he has no intention of correcting that record. 3 years later, Alastair still patrols the Appalachian Trail system, but he has never again taken an assignment in the eastern sectors near Deadman's Ford. When new rangers ask about the area, he tells them it is too remote and dangerous for routine patrol. When hikers inquire about Eastern Trail access, he redirects them to better maintained routes with more reliable communication coverage. Sometimes, on quiet nights when he's working late at the ranger station, he reviews the missing persons reports from his district going back decades. The pattern is there if you know what to look for. Experienced hikers who vanished without explanation, always in the same general area, always leaving behind campsites that show signs of disturbance but no clear evidence of what happened. He is scheduled to retire in 2 years and has already begun training his replacement. But there are some things he will never pass on, some knowledge that dies with the person who carries it. The Eastern Trails will remain officially accessible because closing them would require explanations he is not prepared to give. But he sleeps better knowing that soon, whatever is out there in those ancient woods will be someone else's responsibility to ignore. The chainsaw died mid-cut, which should have been their first warning. A man named Jedediah Stone had been working timber in the Appalachian Mountains for nearly 2 decades. His grandfather came over from the Scottish Highlands in 1962, carrying nothing but his axe and a work ethic that could split granite. He taught Jed's father the trade, and his father taught him. 3 generations of Stones had made their living from these ancient forests, and they thought they knew every ridge, every hollow, every stand of old-growth timber from Virginia to Pennsylvania. They were wrong. The job came to them through a contact at Pinnacle Lumber, a contract to clear a section of private land in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky. The property owner, some development company from Louisville, wanted to harvest the mature hardwood before breaking ground on what they claimed would be a luxury retreat center. It was good money, enough to keep their small crew busy through the winter months when most logging operations shut down. The land itself was beautiful in the way that untouched wilderness can be, rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees that had been growing since before the Civil War. Some of the specimens they were contracted to remove were massive, with trunk diameters that would require their largest equipment and careful planning to bring down safely. The access road was primitive, barely wide enough for their trucks, but they had worked in worse conditions. Their crew consisted of 4 men, including Jed. There was Mateo Garza, their skidder operator, who could maneuver heavy machinery through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. Silas Kane, their feller, whose father had taught him to drop trees with surgical precision in any direction he chose. And Cody Banks, barely 22 years old, but already showing the instincts of a natural logger. They had worked together for 3 years and operated with the kind of efficiency that comes from complete mutual trust. The first week went exactly as planned. They established their staging area near the access road and began working their way systematically through the marked trees. The timber was high quality, mostly red oak and sugar maple with some scattered ash and cherry. The weather cooperated, and their equipment ran without any significant mechanical problems. By Friday afternoon, they had processed nearly 30% of the contracted timber and were ahead of schedule. It was during the second week that things began to feel different. The change was subtle at first, the kind of shift in atmosphere that experienced woodsmen learn to recognize but struggle to articulate. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been. Birds that had been active during their first week became scarce. The usual sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush faded to an unnatural silence that made their equipment seem unnaturally loud. Silas mentioned it first during their lunch break on Monday. He had been working a section of ridgeline about 200 meters from the rest of them when he noticed that his chainsaw was running rough, sputtering and losing power despite having been serviced just days before. When Mateo went to investigate, he found nothing mechanically wrong with the saw, but it continued to perform poorly in that specific area. More concerning was Cody's discovery that afternoon. While limbing a downed oak, he found what appeared to be markings carved into the trunk about 6 feet from the base. The cuts were deep and deliberate, forming symbols that none of them recognized. They were not the result of natural damage or normal forestry operations. Someone or something had taken considerable time and effort to carve these marks into living wood. The symbols were geometric, but somehow organic, angular lines that seemed to flow and curve in ways that hurt to look at directly. Cody counted 7 distinct markings arranged in a rough circle around the circumference of the trunk. When he tried to photograph them with his phone, the camera malfunctioned, producing images that were blurred and distorted beyond recognition. By Wednesday of that second week, their equipment problems had escalated from minor inconveniences to serious safety concerns. Chainsaws that had been running perfectly would suddenly lose power or refuse to start when they tried to work in certain areas. The hydraulic systems on their skidder began experiencing pressure drops that their mechanic could not explain. Most troubling was the behavior of their diesel generator, which would run normally during daylight hours but would sputter and die whenever they tried to operate it after sunset. That same Wednesday, Silas made a discovery that changed everything. While scouting timber in a section they had not yet reached, he found evidence of previous logging activity. Cut stumps, some of them decades old, were scattered throughout an area that their survey maps indicated had never been harvested. The cuts were clean and professional, clearly the work of experienced loggers using quality equipment. But there were no access roads leading to this area, no skid trails showing where the harvested logs had been removed, no equipment marks or tire tracks indicating how machinery had been brought in or taken out. Most puzzling was the arrangement of the stumps themselves, which formed patterns that served no apparent logging purpose, but seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Mateo found the first piece of abandoned equipment on Thursday morning. A chainsaw, probably 20 years old based on the model, was wedged between two rocks near a small creek about half a kilometer from their current work site. The saw was in remarkable condition, considering how long it had apparently been exposed to the elements. The chain was still sharp, the fuel tank was empty but showed no signs of rust or corrosion, and the engine turned over freely when Mateo pulled the starter cord. What made the discovery truly unsettling was the fact that the saw belonged to a company that had gone out of business in 1987. Mateo recognized the logo and color scheme from his early days in the industry. When they checked the serial number, it matched records for equipment that had been reported lost during a logging operation in these same mountains over 15 years earlier. That crew had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind their trucks and most of their equipment at a staging area similar to theirs. The official investigation concluded that the crew had likely become disoriented in heavy fog and fallen into one of the many abandoned mine shafts that dotted the region. Their bodies were never recovered, and the case was eventually closed as an industrial accident. Finding their chainsaw in working condition after all these years raised questions that none of them wanted to consider. Friday morning brought the incident that ended their contract and sent them fleeing from those mountains with their equipment only partially loaded and their work unfinished. Jed was operating his professional-grade chainsaw, a machine he had used reliably for over 5 years, attempting to fell a massive red oak that stood alone in a small clearing. The tree was probably 150 years old, with a trunk diameter of nearly 4 feet and a canopy that dominated the surrounding forest. According to their survey, it was the largest specimen on the property and would yield premium lumber if they could bring it down safely. He made his initial notch cut without any problems, creating the wedge-shaped opening that would control the direction of the tree's fall. The saw was running perfectly. The chain was sharp and the cut was progressing exactly as planned. He moved to the back side of the trunk to begin the felling cut that would complete the job. That was when the chainsaw died mid-cut. Not sputtered, not ran rough, not gradually lost power. It simply stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. The engine fell silent so abruptly that Jed almost lost his balance from the sudden absence of resistance. He tried the electric start, then the pull cord, then checked the fuel and spark plug. Everything appeared normal, but the saw would not start. Cody brought over his backup saw, a smaller model that should have been adequate to complete the felling cut. It started normally and ran smoothly until the moment the chain touched the tree trunk, at which point it died exactly as Jed's had. Mateo tried his saw with identical results. Silas brought over the old chainsaw they had found, and it suffered the same instantaneous failure the moment it contacted the oak. They spent 2 hours troubleshooting equipment that had been working perfectly minutes before. They checked fuel lines, cleaned carburetors, tested ignition systems, and verified that they had proper fuel mixtures. Every saw would start and run normally until they attempted to cut into that specific tree, at which point they would immediately stop. That was when they heard the sound. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a low, rhythmic pounding like someone striking a massive drum. The sound was organic rather than mechanical, with irregular intervals that suggested it was not produced by any kind of machinery. It seemed to come from all directions at once, making it impossible to determine the source or distance. As they stood in that clearing, surrounded by their useless equipment, and listening to that inexplicable sound, Cody pointed to something that made Jed's blood run cold. The symbols he had found carved into the previous tree were appearing on the oak trunk as they watched. Not being carved by any visible tool, but manifesting as if they had always been there and were only now becoming visible. The marks appeared slowly, dark lines that seemed to bleed up from within the wood itself. They formed the same geometric patterns Cody had seen earlier, but larger and more complex. Within minutes, the entire circumference of the trunk was covered with symbols that pulsed with their own dark energy. The drumming sound was getting closer and more intense. Small rocks and pine needles on the forest floor were vibrating with each beat. Their equipment, which had been dead moments before, suddenly roared to life on its own. Chainsaws starting without being touched and running at full throttle with no one operating them. They ran. They left everything except their personal tools and fled to their trucks, not stopping until they reached the main highway 20 minutes later. When Mateo called their contact at Pinnacle Lumber to report that they were terminating the contract, he was told that the development company had dissolved 3 days earlier and that no one had authorized any logging operations on that property. They never went back for their equipment. 6 months later, Cody drove past the access road and reported that their staging area was completely overgrown, as if it had been abandoned for years rather than months. There was no sign of their generators, skidders, or the processed timber they had left behind. Jed still works timber in the Appalachian Mountains, but he has learned to recognize the signs that tell you when a forest does not want to be disturbed. Some trees are meant to stand forever, and some sounds in the wilderness should never be investigated. The previous logging crew learned that lesson 15 years too late. They were luckier, or perhaps they were simply better at listening to warnings that others had ignored. A woman named Eleanor Vance buried the memory so deep she convinced herself it was just a nightmare, until her sister brought up that camping trip last Thanksgiving dinner. What she is about to share happened when she was 8 years old, during the summer of 1994. Her family had just moved from Cardiff to a small town in western North Carolina, where her father had taken a position as a mining engineer with a company that was reopening some of the old copper mines in the Appalachian foothills. The transition had been difficult for her and her sister, Sarah, leaving behind their friends and extended family in Wales to start over in a place that felt completely foreign. To help them adjust, their parents planned a series of weekend camping trips throughout that first summer. Their father, Arthur Vance, had been an avid outdoorsman back in Wales, and he believed that exploring the American wilderness would help them fall in love with their new country. Their mother, Helen, was less enthusiastic about camping but supported the plan as a way to build family memories. The camping trip that changed everything was scheduled for the last weekend in July. They planned to spend 3 days at a remote campground in the Pisgah National Forest, an area known for its pristine mountain streams and old-growth forests. Arthur had selected the location specifically because it was far from established hiking trails and tourist attractions, a place where they could experience what he called true wilderness. The campground was primitive, accessible only by a narrow dirt road. There were no facilities, no designated campsites, and no other visitors. They set up their tents in a small clearing beside a creek that Arthur, consulting his topographic map, named Whisper Branch, though Alina never understood why until years later. Sarah, who was 11 and always more adventurous, immediately began exploring while their parents set up equipment. Alina was more cautious, preferring to stay close to the familiar comfort of their blue canvas tents. But even from the safety of the campsite, she could sense something different about this place. The forest was older, denser. The trees were massive, their canopy so thick that even during midday, the light that filtered down was dim and green, creating an underwater quality that made everything seem muted and distant. But it was the silence that bothered her most. In their previous camping experiences, the woods had always been full of sound, birds calling, insects buzzing. Here, the quiet was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Even Whisper Branch lived up to its name, flowing past their camp with barely a murmur. On their first evening, as they sat around the campfire, Sarah announced she had found something interesting. About half a kilometer upstream, she had discovered the remains of an old homestead, stone foundations, rusted pieces of farm equipment, and household items that looked abandoned for decades. Their father was immediately interested, and he suggested they hike to the site together the following morning. Their mother was less enthusiastic, mentioning the dangers of collapsed structures and old wells. That night, Alina had the first of what she would later remember as dreams, but now understands were something else entirely. She found herself standing alone at the edge of their campsite in the middle of the night. The campfire had burned down to glowing coals. Sarah's sleeping bag in the tent she shared with her was empty. The forest, unnaturally quiet during the day, was now filled with sound, but these were not the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife. What she heard was human activity, voices speaking in low tones just beyond the firelight. The sound of footsteps moving through the underbrush with careful, deliberate steps. Occasionally, she could make out what sounded like children laughing, but the laughter had a quality that made her want to hide. As she stood there in her pajamas, too frightened to move, she became aware that the voices and footsteps were getting closer, circling the camp at a consistent distance, as if following an invisible boundary. She tried to call for her parents, but no sound came. She tried to run, but her legs would not respond. The voices became clearer, and she realized they were not speaking English. The language was unfamiliar, but somehow seemed ancient. The circling continued for what felt like hours. Eventually, the voices began to fade, and the footsteps grew more distant until the forest returned to its unnatural silence. Only then was she able to move, rushing back to her tent, where she found Sarah sleeping peacefully. She woke the next morning, convinced it had been a vivid nightmare. Her family showed no signs of having been disturbed. When Sarah asked if she wanted to explore the old homestead, Alina agreed readily, eager to focus on daytime adventures. The hike to the ruins took them through a beautiful forest, following Whisper Branch deeper into the mountains. When they reached the homestead, Eleanor understood Sarah's excitement. The stone foundations were substantial, indicating a significant structure. Her father examined the construction and concluded it was likely built in the late 1800s. The quality of the stonework suggested it was intended to last for generations. But the location was impractical for farming, and there was no obvious access route for transporting heavy materials. While their parents explored, Eleanor and Sarah wandered through the scattered artifacts. It was Sarah who made the discovery that transformed their understanding of the site. Partially buried under fallen leaves, she uncovered a collection of small, carved wooden objects depicting human figures. They were stylized, elongated, and angular, with features that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewing angle. The expressions on the carved faces conveyed emotions that seemed too complex and dark for simple folk art. As they prepared to return to camp, Sarah made one final discovery: a smaller foundation behind the main house, almost completely hidden by undergrowth. The stones were arranged in geometric, organic patterns, similar to the carvings. Their father studied the arrangement, taking photos and making sketches, but he could not determine the building's purpose. That night, the dreams returned with greater intensity. Again, Eleanor found herself standing alone at the edge of the campsite. This time, she could understand the voices circling the camp perfectly, as if they were speaking directly into her mind. They were calling her name, inviting her to join them, promising to show her things. The temptation was almost overwhelming. Curiosity warred with fear, and curiosity was winning. She found herself taking small steps away from the campsite, drawn toward the sounds. She had made it perhaps 20 meters from the tents when Sarah appeared beside her. She took Eleanor's hand without a word and began leading her back toward the safety of the camp. As they walked, she spoke in the same ancient language Eleanor had been hearing from the forest, responding to the voices that were still calling her name. It was only when they reached their tent that Eleanor realized Sarah was still sleeping in her bag. The Sarah who had led her back dissolved like morning fog, leaving Eleanor alone with the chilling understanding that something in those woods had worn her sister's face to keep her safe from whatever else was calling to her. They broke camp the next morning, 3 days earlier than planned. Her parents never explained the sudden change in their itinerary. For 30 years, Eleanor convinced herself the entire experience had been nothing more than childhood imagination. But last Thanksgiving, Sarah brought up that camping trip. She mentioned casually that she had never been able to sleep properly during their time at Whisper Branch, because she kept having to get up at night to bring Eleanor back to their tent. According to her memory, Eleanor had sleepwalked repeatedly, and Sarah had spent most of those nights awake, watching to make sure she didn't wander into the forest alone. She remembered the voices calling from the woods, though she claimed she could never understand what they were saying. She remembered the sense of something circling their campsite. Most significantly, she remembered that the voices had been specifically calling for Eleanor, trying to lure her away. Sarah then told her something Eleanor had never known. On their final morning at the campsite, while they were packing, Sarah had walked back to the homestead ruins one last time to retrieve a small carving she had hidden. When she reached the site, she found that all evidence of human habitation had disappeared. The stone foundations were gone, the scattered artifacts had vanished, and the forest floor showed no signs that any structure had ever existed. She searched for over an hour, but everything was identical except for the complete absence of the ruins they had explored just the day before. She never told their parents, afraid they wouldn't believe her. Instead, she kept the carved figure she had taken. But within a week of their return home, the carving had changed. The human figure had become something else, something with features too disturbing for an 11-year-old to look at comfortably. Eventually, she buried it in their backyard, and to her knowledge, it remains there still. Eleanor is now 38, married with 2 children of her own. She lives far from the mountains where these events occurred. But sometimes on quiet summer nights, she finds herself listening for voices that might be calling her name from whatever dark places still exist in this modern world. And sometimes she thinks she hears them, patient and persistent, still trying to finish a conversation that began 30 years ago beside Whisper Branch, in a forest that may or may not have ever really existed. While researching 19th-century settlement records, a professor discovered something that made him cancel his field research immediately. His name was Alaric Thorne, and he had spent the last 25 years studying the patterns of European immigration and settlement in the Appalachian Mountains. His specialty was the documentation of isolated communities that established themselves in remote mountain valleys, often developing unique cultural practices. The research that led to his most disturbing discovery began innocuously enough in the archives of the West Virginia Historical Society. He was investigating land-grant records for a book about Welsh mining communities when he encountered repeated references to a settlement called Quinlan Valley. The name was clearly Welsh, but the location descriptions were frustratingly vague, referring only to remote highlands and beyond the settled districts. What made these references particularly intriguing was their consistency across multiple documents spanning nearly 7 decades. Immigration records, land surveys, census data, and even church records all contained mentions of Quinlan Valley, but none provided sufficient detail to establish its precise location. More puzzling was that the settlement appeared to have maintained a stable population of approximately 200 residents throughout this entire period, despite having no apparent economic foundation or connection to larger transportation networks. Quinlan Valley seemed to violate every established pattern of immigrant settlement behavior. His initial assumption was that it was a religious community that had deliberately isolated itself. However, as he delved deeper, this explanation became untenable. Religious communities typically left extensive documentation. Quinlan Valley appeared in official records but left no trace of its own, no church records, no theological writings, no correspondence. The breakthrough came when he discovered a collection of personal papers donated by the estate of Dr. Silas Crane, a physician who had practiced in the mountain regions of West Virginia during the 1880s. Among his medical journals, Alaric found detailed notes describing a visit Dr. Crane had made to Quinlan Valley in the autumn of 1887 to treat a mysterious illness. His journal entries provide the only first-hand account of life within this isolated community. According to Crane's notes, he was approached by 2 men from the valley who appeared at his office in Charleston. They provided no names but offered a generous fee plus travel expenses if he would accompany them immediately. The journey took 3 days through increasingly remote terrain, following ancient trails that did not appear on any maps. When they finally reached Quinlan Valley, Dr. Crane found a community that defied his expectations. It consisted of approximately 40 stone houses built into the hillsides in a way that made them nearly invisible from the valley floor, surrounded by sophisticated agricultural terraces. But it was the people who truly puzzled him. They were clearly of Welsh origin, speaking a dialect he recognized but could not fully understand. The adults were uniformly tall and lean with pale skin that seemed almost translucent and eyes that reflected light, more like nocturnal animals than humans. More disturbing was their apparent age distribution. Crane noted that while the community claimed nearly 200 residents, he encountered no children and only a handful of adults who appeared to be under the age of 40. When he inquired, his questions were deflected with vague references to seasonal migrations. The illness that had prompted his visit was unlike anything in his medical experience. The affected individuals suffered from a wasting condition that caused rapid weight loss, extreme sensitivity to sunlight, and a peculiar aversion to certain foods. The symptoms occurred in cycles, with periods of recovery followed by sudden, severe relapses. His usual remedies had no effect. The settlement's leaders told him the illness was a seasonal affliction that had affected their community for generations, suggesting they had brought him there more to satisfy some obligation than from any expectation of a cure. On his final evening, Dr. Crane made observations that fundamentally challenged his understanding of human society. While eating dinner with a family, he noticed that none of the adults consumed the food. They sat quietly while he ate, explaining that their dietary requirements were different. In 3 days, he never saw any resident consume normal food. More disturbing were the sounds at night, what sounded like large groups of people moving through the valley in a coordinated fashion. But when he looked outside, he could see no one. On his final morning, as his guides prepared to escort him back, Crane attempted to create a detailed map of the valley's location. His guides became visibly agitated, insisting such documentation was unnecessary and dangerous. They physically removed his mapping materials and destroyed his notes. The return journey to Charleston took only 1 day, following roads he was certain they had not used before. He never saw his guides again and never received payment. When he tried to return months later, he was unable to locate any of the trails or landmarks. No official sources, land surveys, tax records, census data, showed any evidence of permanent habitation in the area. According to official records, the remote valleys were completely uninhabited wilderness. Professor Thorne discovered Dr. Crane's journal in 1998, and it became the focus of his research. Using the descriptions and geographical references, he spent 2 years attempting to locate Quinlan Valley with modern surveying techniques. The search was ultimately successful. In a remote valley that matched Crane's description perfectly, he discovered the ruins of approximately 40 stone structures. The construction techniques were remarkably sophisticated, but the ruins showed clear evidence of having been abandoned for decades, possibly centuries. Most disturbing was his discovery of what appeared to be a community cemetery. It contained approximately 200 graves marked with stone monuments bearing Welsh names and dates spanning from 1834 to 1889. According to these markers, the final burial in Quinlan Valley had occurred just 2 years after Dr. Crane's visit. Professor Thorne has never published his findings. The questions raised by this discovery challenge fundamental assumptions about historical documentation that he is not prepared to address in an academic context. But sometimes, when he's working late in his office, he finds himself reviewing Dr. Crane's journal and wondering about the nature of the illness he had been summoned to treat. His description of symptoms that occurred in cycles, patients who avoided sunlight, and a community where no one seemed to eat normal food suggests possibilities that no rational academic should consider. The location of Quinlan Valley will remain his secret. Some historical mysteries are better left unsolved. In 15 years of search and rescue, A certain detective had seen things that would make you never want to go hiking again. But one case broke her entire team. Her name was Evelyn Reid, and she led the Specialized Wilderness Search and Rescue Unit for the Virginia State Police, covering the Blue Ridge Mountains region. Her team handled everything from lost hikers to missing persons cases in some of the most remote and challenging terrain on the East Coast. What they encountered during the Stanton case in October 2019 forced them to abandon everything they thought they knew about wilderness search operations. The initial call came in on a Thursday evening. 3 experienced hikers had been reported overdue after failing to check in from a routine weekend backpacking trip. The missing persons were Dr. Marcus Stanton, a 45-year-old physician, his wife Laura, a 41-year-old high school teacher, and their 16-year-old son Ethan, an Eagle Scout with extensive wilderness experience. The Stantons had planned a 3-day trek through a section of the George Washington National Forest. They had filed a detailed itinerary and carried proper equipment, including GPS devices and emergency beacons. Their failure to communicate was completely out of character. By Monday morning, a full-scale search operation was launched. Their vehicle was found exactly where it should have been at the designated trailhead, locked and undisturbed. The first day of searching produced evidence that the Stantons had begun their hike as planned. Witnesses at a popular overlook remembered seeing a family matching their description on Saturday morning. They had appeared to be in good spirits. But somewhere between the overlook and their planned first-night camping area, they had vanished completely. The terrain where they disappeared was familiar to the team, rolling forested hills crossed by well-maintained trails. Weather conditions had been ideal. By the 3rd day of searching, the team had covered every established trail in the area using ground teams, helicopter surveillance, and K-9 units. Despite their extensive efforts, they had found no additional trace of the Stanton family. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning when one of the K-9 teams picked up a scent trail leading away from the established path system into an area of dense forest. The trail was faint and intermittent, but it was their first concrete lead. Following it required technical climbing equipment as it led through terrain far more challenging than anything the Stantons would have attempted voluntarily. After 4 hours of difficult progress, the tracking team reached a small clearing approximately 3 kilometers from the nearest trail. The site appeared to have been used as a temporary campsite, but its condition raised immediate questions. The fire ring contained the remains of a blaze that had burned far hotter and longer than normal. The ashes contained partially burned fragments of fabric that appeared to match clothing descriptions of the Stanton family. Personal items were scattered throughout the clearing as if thrown. They found Dr. Stanton's wallet, its contents intact but the leather scorched. Laura's hiking boots were located at opposite edges of the clearing, both showing signs of unexplainable damage. Most significantly, they discovered Ethan's backpack hanging from a tree branch approximately 4 meters above the ground, far too high to have been placed there by normal means. The scent trail continued beyond the campsite, but it had changed. The K-9 handlers reported that their dogs were displaying signs of extreme agitation and refused to follow the trail further. These were experienced search dogs, and their handlers had never seen them react with such obvious fear. When the team attempted to continue tracking without the dogs, they made discoveries that forced them to request additional resources. The trail led to a series of natural rock formations, creating a maze of narrow passages and hidden chambers extending deep into the mountainside. These geological features were not marked on any topographic maps. Inside the largest chamber, approximately 30 meters from the entrance, they found what appeared to be the Stantons' final campsite. Their tent was still standing, but had been damaged in a way that defied explanation. The fabric was torn in long, parallel lines, as if raked by sharp claws, but the pattern was too systematic and extensive to have been caused by any known wildlife. The interior of the tent told a story of desperate struggle. Sleeping bags were twisted and partially pulled outside. Personal belongings were scattered, many showing the same type of heat damage they had observed at the previous campsite. But it was the walls of the chamber that provided the most disturbing evidence. Covering nearly every accessible surface were desperate messages scratched into the stone. The handwriting was clearly recognizable as belonging to Dr. Stanton, Laura, and Ethan. The earliest messages, apparently written by Dr. Stanton, described their arrival and decision to establish an emergency camp after becoming lost. These entries were rational and organized, but as the messages progressed, they became increasingly frantic and incoherent. Laura's writing described sounds from the forest, voices calling their names from impossible directions. Ethan's contributions mentioned seeing figures moving between the trees, always at the edge of visibility, watching their campsite. The final messages, all apparently written by Dr. Stanton, described an organized assault on their position by entities he could not identify. His writing became increasingly erratic as he documented the systematic destruction of their equipment and the gradual approach of whatever had been stalking them. The last legible message, scratched into the stone near the tent entrance, consisted of a single sentence: "They are not human and they are not gone." They found no trace of the Stantons themselves. The scent trail simply ended at the chamber entrance, as if they had vanished into the stone. The investigation continued for another 2 weeks, involving specialists from federal agencies and academic institutions. Geologists confirmed the rock formations were natural, but acknowledged their configuration was highly unusual. Wildlife experts could not explain the claw marks on the tent or the heat damage to the items. The official report classified the Stanton disappearance as a missing persons case with unknown circumstances. The case remains open. What Detective Reed never reported is what happened to the members of her search team who spent extended time in that chamber. Within 6 months, 3 of the most experienced personnel had requested transfers or resigned. 2 others required extended medical leave for stress-related conditions their doctors could not explain. The K-9 handlers reported their dogs never fully recovered and had to be retired. Evelyn herself has experienced changes. She no longer sleeps well in wilderness environments. She finds herself constantly alert for sounds that might indicate the presence of something that should not exist. The chamber where they found the Stantons' final campsite has been sealed and removed from all official maps. The area is now classified as geologically unstable and off-limits. Park rangers have been instructed to redirect hikers away from any routes that might lead them toward those rock formations. Evelyn Reed continues to lead search and rescue operations, but she has implemented new protocols that prioritize team safety over investigation completeness. They no longer follow scent trails that lead away from established path systems and terminate searches if their K-9 units display unusual agitation or fear. Some missing persons cases are better left unsolved. The Stanton family taught them that the mountains hold secrets their training has not prepared them to confront. She prays they never encounter another case like theirs. When a man inherited his great-uncle's cabin, the lawyer handed him the deed and a sealed letter with one instruction: "Read this after your first night alone on the property." His name was Arthur Croft, and until 2 years ago, he was a successful software engineer living in London, completely disconnected from his American family heritage. His knowledge of his great-uncle Elias extended no further than occasional mentions during family gatherings, and a vague understanding that he had lived as a hermit in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee for over 40 years. The inheritance came as a complete surprise. The estate attorney, a Mr. Jeremiah Pinter from Knoxville, explained that Elias had specified in his will that his property should pass to the eldest male descendant of the Croft line currently residing outside the mountain region. The language was archaic, but it made Arthur the sole heir to 200 acres of remote mountain land. Mr. Pinter's initial description was vague, mentioning a cabin, outbuildings, and mineral rights. The sealed letter he provided was on heavy, expensive paper, sealed with dark red wax bearing the impression of a symbol Arthur did not recognize, something like a tree with roots that extended in impossible directions. Mr. Pinter emphasized that Elias had been very specific about when the letter should be opened. Arthur's initial plan was to visit for a weekend, assess the property's value, and decide whether to sell. The drive from Knoxville took nearly 3 hours, the final 10 kilometers accessible only by a gravel track that wound through dense forest with no cell coverage. The cabin itself was far larger and more substantial than he had expected, a 2-story log structure with a stone foundation and a wide porch facing west. The construction was the work of a skilled hand, but the design was unsettling. The windows were small and fitted with heavy wooden shutters that could be secured from inside with iron bars. The main entrance was a massive oak door reinforced with metal bands and equipped with multiple locks of different ages and styles. The interior was even more surprising. Elias had lived simply but comfortably, with handcrafted furniture and extensive bookshelves. The cabin had electricity and running water, fed by independent generators and well systems. Most intriguing was the library, which occupied nearly the entire second floor and contained hundreds of books on subjects from Appalachian folklore to geology and anthropology, suggesting his great-uncle had been far more educated than his reputation indicated. As evening approached on his first day, Arthur prepared for a peaceful night. It was only after darkness fell completely that he began to understand why Elias had lived behind reinforced doors and barred windows. The sounds began around 1000 p.m. Subtle at first, but gradually becoming more distinct. From the surrounding forest came what appeared to be coordinated movement, multiple entities traveling through the underbrush in patterns that suggested intelligence. The sounds were too regular to be natural, yet too systematic to be human. He initially dismissed the noises as his imagination, but as the evening progressed, the sounds grew closer and more deliberate. By midnight, he could clearly distinguish what appeared to be multiple individuals circling the cabin at a consistent distance. Occasionally, he could hear low vocalizations that resembled human speech, but in a language he could not identify. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever was moving through the forest was specifically focused on the cabin, as if studying the structure and assessing its defenses. Arthur spent most of that night in the living room with the shutters closed and locked, listening and trying to convince himself he was overreacting. As dawn approached and the sounds faded, he found himself checking the locks and examining the iron bars with a new appreciation for their necessity. The sealed letter was waiting on the kitchen table. Its contents challenged everything he thought he understood about his family and his inheritance. Arthur, if you're reading this, then you have survived your first night on Croft land and experienced what our family has guarded against for over 2 centuries. The property you have inherited is not simply a cabin and forest acreage. It is a responsibility passed down our bloodline since your ancestor, Ezekiel Croft, first settled here in 1823. Ezekiel did not choose this location for its beauty. He came here because something had to be contained, something the Cherokee tribes had once managed through rituals and knowledge that died with their forced removal. When the government relocated the Cherokee, they left behind warnings about places that should not be disturbed. Your great-great-grandfather understood these warnings too late. By the time he realized what he had awakened through his clearing and construction, the damage was done. The things that live in the deep places of these mountains had been given access to the surface world. The Croft family has spent 6 generations learning how to contain this threat. The cabin was not built as a home. It was constructed as a guardhouse, positioned to monitor and control access to the areas where these entities maintain their strongest presence. The sounds you heard last night were a test. They come every few months to assess the defenses and determine whether the guardian is still present. If the cabin remains empty for too long, they will begin to expand their territory. You now have a choice. You can accept the responsibility of maintaining the containment, learning the rituals and precautions that will keep these entities confined. Or you can abandon the property, knowing that whatever follows you home will be your fault and your burden to bear. If you choose to stay, examine the basement. You will find documents that explain everything. If you choose to leave, burn this letter and never speak of what you have inherited. But know this, the Croft bloodline carries a responsibility that cannot be escaped. What your ancestor awakened in 1823 remains active, and it remembers the family that disturbed its ancient sleep. Choose wisely. Your great-uncle, Elias Croft Arthur, spent the rest of that morning exploring the basement. Hidden behind a false wall, he found a century's worth of documentation detailing encounters, containment procedures, and the gradual understanding his family had developed. The records were meticulous and terrifying. Generation after generation had documented their experiences with creatures that defied classification. The basement contained maps showing emergence points, calendars marking periods of increased activity, and detailed instructions for rituals. Most significantly, he found evidence that other families in remote Appalachian regions were dealing with similar situations. The Crofts were not unique. They were part of a network of bloodlines that had inherited this responsibility. 2 years later, Arthur remains at the cabin. He resigned from his position in London and learned to live according to the schedules and precautions his family developed. The sounds in the forest have become familiar. He has also begun preparing for the eventual transfer of responsibility to the next generation. The Croft line will continue and the burden of guardianship will pass. He is no longer Arthur Croft, the software engineer. He is Arthur Croft, the guardian. The choice, as Elias warned, was never really his to make. Some responsibilities choose their bearers. What lies beneath Croft land remembers everything, and it is patient enough to wait. A wildlife tracking study was supposed to last 6 months. The team packed up and left after 3 weeks, and the lead biologist never published the findings. Her name was Dr. Eris Thorne, a wildlife biologist specializing in predator-prey relationships. For 12 years, she had conducted field research throughout North America. The project that ended her career in field research began in the spring of 2021, when she received funding to conduct a comprehensive study of black bear populations in a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, extending from eastern Quebec into northern Maine. Her research team consisted of 3 graduate students and 2 experienced field technicians. They planned to establish a series of remote monitoring stations throughout approximately 500 square kilometers of old-growth forest, using trail cameras, radio collars, and GPS tracking devices. The study area was pristine wilderness, virtually untouched by logging or development. Their base camp was established at the southern edge of the study area, near a small lake that provided helicopter access. The nearest road was over 40 kilometers away. The first indication that something was unusual came during their initial survey work. They discovered evidence of bear activity that did not conform to any documented behavioral patterns. They found deliberately constructed arrangements of stones and fallen logs in locations with heavy bear traffic. These structures served no apparent practical purpose and displayed engineering principles that seemed far beyond the cognitive capabilities of black bears. More puzzling was the discovery of trees that had been systematically stripped of bark in patterns suggesting tool use. The stripping was too precise and organized to result from typical bear foraging. Her graduate student, Leo Vance, documented over 200 examples of these anomalous markings. GPS mapping revealed they occurred in regular intervals along what appeared to be established travel routes. But it was the absence of normal bear sign that truly concerned them. Despite clear evidence of a substantial population, they had not observed any bears directly or recorded them on their trail cameras. They found no scat, no footprints, no hair samples. It was as if the bears in this region were deliberately avoiding any form of detection while simultaneously leaving behind clear evidence of their organized activities. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week when their motion-activated cameras began recording footage that forced them to reconsider everything. The initial recordings, captured at night, showed groups of black bears moving through the forest in single-file formation, following precise routes and maintaining consistent spacing. This level of organization was unprecedented. More disturbing were subsequent recordings that showed bears engaged in what could only be described as construction activities. Using rocks, fallen logs, and stripped bark, groups of bears were systematically building structures that served no identifiable biological purpose. The construction process was coordinated and methodical. The structures themselves defied explanation. They were geometric rather than organic, incorporating architectural principles that required spatial reasoning and planning far beyond anything previously documented. Some appeared to be communication devices arranged to channel sound. Others seemed designed to create specific visual effects. Most unsettling was the realization that the bears were aware of their presence and were deliberately modifying their behavior. Trail cameras captured footage of bears systematically dismantling and relocating their monitoring equipment, always at night, and with careful precision that left the devices undamaged but positioned to record empty forest. The bears were not just avoiding the cameras, they were studying their research methods and adapting their behavior to render their scientific observations ineffective. The incident that ended the research occurred during their final week. Leo Vance had volunteered for overnight observation duty at a remote monitoring station, positioned on a rocky outcropping that provided clear sight lines across a valley. He was equipped with night vision equipment, radio communication, and emergency supplies. His final radio transmission came at 2:17 a.m. "Dr. Thorne, you need to see this. They are not bears. Repeat, they are not bears. They are something else entirely. And they know I am watching them." When they lost contact with Leo, Standard protocol required them to notify helicopter support and initiate extraction, but their radio equipment malfunctioned simultaneously, leaving them stranded. Dr. Thorne organized a search team to reach Leo's observation post. The hike took most of the day. What they found challenged every assumption about wildlife. The observation post had been systematically dismantled and reconstructed in a configuration that served no apparent practical purpose. Leo's equipment had been carefully arranged in geometric patterns. Leo himself was nowhere to be found, but his absence was clearly deliberate. His personal belongings had been sorted and arranged according to size, color, and material. His research notes had been removed from his backpack and spread across the ground in patterns that resembled the structural modifications they had been documenting. Most significantly, they found evidence that whatever had taken Leo had left a message. Using stones arranged in precise geometric patterns, someone or something had created symbols that incorporated elements of their GPS mapping system, camera placement strategies, and data collection protocols. The message was clearly intended to demonstrate that their research methods had been observed, understood, and rendered ineffective. The final element was a detailed reproduction of their helicopter landing schedule, created using materials from Leo's equipment and positioned to be visible from the air. They abandoned their research immediately and signaled for emergency extraction. The official report classified Leo as missing due to a wilderness accident. Dr. Thorne has never returned to field research and has never published any of the findings. The footage and documentation remain sealed in her personal files. Leo Vance was never found, but she knows what happened to him. The structures they documented were not created by bears. They were constructed by something that uses bear forms as camouflage while engaging in activities that serve purposes they cannot comprehend. Their research was ended not by equipment failure, but by the intervention of intelligences that refuse to allow their activities to be documented. The mountains keep their secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. A family has lived in these mountains for 5 generations, and there is one rule they have never broken, until last winter, when one man had to. His name was Caleb Hayes, and he was the last of his bloodline to call the Appalachian Mountains of Southwest Virginia home. The Hayes family has been rooted in these hills since 1847, when his great-great-grandfather first cleared land in what is now known as Devil's Backbone Hollow. 5 generations have lived and died within a 20-mile radius of the original homestead, and they have all learned the same fundamental truth. There are places in these mountains where decent folk do not go. Every mountain family has its rules, warnings passed down about areas to avoid. Outsiders dismiss these as superstition, but families like the Hayeses know better. The Hayes family rule was simple and absolute: never enter Bone Valley after dark, and never enter Bone Valley alone, regardless of the time of day. This restriction had been maintained without exception since his great-great-grandfather's time. Bone Valley is a narrow ravine that cuts deep into the mountains about 8 miles northeast of their family land. The valley gets its name from the massive accumulation of animal bones that litter the ravine floor: deer, bear, wild boar, and creatures Caleb cannot identify. The bones are not scattered randomly. They are arranged in deliberate patterns that suggest intentional placement by some organizing intelligence. His grandfather, Samuel Hayes, was the last family member to enter Bone Valley before Caleb's own violation. As a young man in 1962, He had tracked a wounded bear into the ravine and spent a night trapped there by an early snowstorm. What he experienced changed him fundamentally, transforming a confident mountain man into someone who refused to discuss certain topics. Samuel would only say that the arrangements of bones in the valley served a purpose that living creatures were not meant to understand, creating pathways for things that should not exist in our world. Family stories about Bone Valley extend back through every generation. But it was Caleb's younger sister, Eliza, who provided the most compelling evidence that the warnings were based on genuine threats. Eliza was born with what mountain families call the sight, an ability to perceive aspects of the natural world hidden from most people. When she was 12, she began having dreams about Bone Valley that were too detailed and specific to be imagination. She described the exact arrangement of bones, the peculiar quality of light, and the sensation of being watched by entities just beyond the edge of visibility. Most disturbing were her claims that something in the valley was calling to her, promising to share knowledge that would expand her abilities. The voice in her dreams spoke of the connection between the living and the dead, of cycles of existence beyond human understanding. Eliza begged their parents to let her visit Bone Valley, arguing that the entity was not malevolent. Their parents refused absolutely, but her dreams continued, becoming more vivid and compelling. Eliza Hayes disappeared on her 19th birthday in November 1998. She left no note and took no personal belongings, but they all knew where she had gone. The search lasted 3 weeks, but they never entered Bone Valley itself. Eliza was never found. For 25 years, Caleb honored the family rule, but last winter, circumstances forced him to make a choice. His 8-year-old grandson, Samuel, had been staying with him. Samuel is Eliza's nephew, and he has inherited some measure of her sensitivity. On Saturday afternoon, Samuel announced that he needed to go to Bone Valley to help someone who was trapped and calling for assistance. His certainty was absolute, his description too detailed to dismiss. According to Samuel, a hiker had fallen into the ravine and was injured too severely to climb out. Caleb called the county sheriff, but their records showed no overdue hikers. When he tried to convince Samuel he was mistaken, the boy became increasingly agitated, insisting the person would die if they did not respond immediately. The decision to enter Bone Valley was the most difficult choice Caleb had ever made. Every instinct warned against it. But Samuel's distress was genuine. He loaded his truck with rope and first aid supplies, then drove Samuel to the valley entrance as the sun was setting on a cold December evening. His plan was a quick search of the accessible areas before full darkness. The entrance to Bone Valley is marked by 2 massive oak trees that have grown together in a natural arch. As they passed beneath it, Samuel immediately pointed toward a section of the valley floor. Even in the failing light, Caleb could see that the normal arrangement of bones had been disturbed. They found the hiker exactly where Samuel had predicted, a middle-aged man who had fallen from the ridge above and suffered a broken leg. He had been trapped for nearly 2 days, growing increasingly hypothermic. The rescue operation required nearly 3 hours. By the time they managed to get him evacuated, full darkness had settled, and they had clearly violated every aspect of the Hayes family rule. But it was during the rescue that Caleb began to understand. The arrangements of bones formed complex geometric patterns that created optical illusions and distorted spatial perception. More disturbing was the realization that the patterns were constantly changing, with individual bones moving from one position to another. As they worked, Caleb became aware that they were being observed by entities that remained just beyond the edge of vision. Most unsettling was the discovery that the hiker himself was not entirely human. His injuries were real, but his body temperature was far below what should have been survivable, yet he remained conscious. His broken leg showed evidence of healing that should have required weeks. His eyes reflected light in the darkness like those of a nocturnal predator. When they finally reached the valley entrance, the rescued hiker thanked them and then simply walked away into the forest, moving with fluid grace despite his supposedly broken leg. Samuel watched him disappear and then said quietly, "He was the bait, Grandpa. They wanted us to come into the valley." Caleb has never returned to Bone Valley, and he has reinforced the family rule with new emphasis. But he knows that their 150-year tradition of avoidance has been broken, and that whatever exists in that ravine now has a connection to the Hayes family that did not exist before. Samuel has begun having dreams similar to those that plagued his great-aunt Eliza. He speaks of voices calling from Bone Valley, promising knowledge and abilities. The parallels are exact, and Caleb fears that history is preparing to repeat itself. Some rules exist for reasons that become clear only when you break them. He saved one life by entering Bone Valley, but he may have doomed another by providing whatever lives there with access to Samuel's unique abilities. The mountains keep their bargains, and they always collect what they are owed. The Hayes family rule will die with Caleb because there will be no one left to pass it on.